right. Hi, welcome to Surviving This Horror. This episode is a little bit different than usual because I actually recorded the audio from my live broadcast. I have a live broadcast version on the WIUX B-Side internet radio station of Surviving This Horror, and I got to have a wonderful interview with Mike from the Cozy Crow studio. And we did a little interview and open conversation about his upcoming game called Desecration. It is a survival horror 90s indie plot-driven adventure horror game. And I got to do a interview with him. So the way that this works is this is actually audio that I recorded from that interview session. And so I apologize if the quality is a little more sloppier, a little bit different than usual. I tried to edit and stitch it together so I can spread the word and share this to further masses online. I am also going to apologize if some of the audio seems a little disjointed. I did a very poor job of last minute recording the audio from our interview session, so I'm trying to include as much as I can of what we talked about, all the questions I asked. So I apologize if I didn't really get to everything. And this episode might be a little bit shorter than usual because for my live broadcast, I include music sessions. But if I include the music, I will get in deep trouble from Mr. YouTube. So I will not do that. So thanks, and I hope you enjoy the episode. Hello, you are listening to the WIUX B-Side Internet Radio, and you are listening to Survive This Horror. Survive This Horror is a podcast and radio show where each week or each episode I discuss the epic and cool nature of horror video games. I usually just talk about like a brief origin, development history, do a little franchise speedrun if it's a franchise, but like do a plot summary. And then I wrap it up with a general analysis of like stuff I don't like, stuff I do like, about a certain game. I'm Lily. I will be your spooky dookie host. First, a little bit of housekeeping. Thank you to WIUX for sponsoring and assisting in the production of this podcast and the show. Tonight, actually will be a little bit different. I will be talking about a upcoming indie game about guilt and dead bodies. It's really cool. The game is called Desecration. But it's going to be a little bit different because instead of usually my usual structure, I will be having an interview with the lead director, Mike. But before I continue, if you feel so inclined to listen to more, check out the WIUX podcast tab. You can also go on YouTube and Newgrounds at Survive This WIUX for more Surviving This Horror content, where I post my podcast every now and then. And then I also will be here every Friday night, 8 to 9 p.m. talking about scary horror video games. But tonight, like I said, I'm doing something special. I have a member of the Cozy Crow game studio, or the dev team behind Desecration, and I wanted to have a conversation, a little interview with them about the game. So I would like to introduce Mike, if you want to tell me a bit about yourself and your like role, a part of the team and everything.
Oh yeah, so I am Mike. I'm the producer of the game Desecration. I'm also the co-lead, as we also call it, crow lead of Cozy Crow Studios. So basically, yeah, I've been the producer of Desecration for about 2 years, and we'll be launching the game on May 9th.
Nice. I guess to start off, what is your history with video games in general, and then like your history with horror video games? Like what, like personally speaking, even before you got into like producing games and stuff like that, like what is your connection with, I guess, the gaming industry?
Alright, so one of the first video games I ever laid eyes of was an arcade cabinet of the game Altered Beast that my father showed me. For some reason he had one in his garage, and he showed it off to me and taught me how to use it at like 3 years old.
Nice.
In terms of horror games, however, I didn't really get into the horror game scene until Amnesia: The Dark Descent came out. I remember watching a lot of Let's Plays from PewDiePie and Markiplier, and
Nice.
I always enjoyed seeing them scared. When I was about 13 years old, I opened up my own YouTube channel. It's called Leakum now, but it used to be called Macabre Studios, and I tried playing a bunch of horror games, but since I didn't have a lot of money, I did a bunch of Roblox horror games.
Honestly, when I talk to a lot of my friends, that's usually like a lot of friends, or at least people our age, a lot of people be like, yeah, my first introduction to horror games was like literally like either Minecraft or Roblox horror games. It's the bar is very, very low. I had a similar, I guess, uprising as well, where like I got introduced to video games probably at a way too young of an age because I would just watch my dad play video games at night, or because I'd be like bored or something. And like the very first horror game that I got introduced to, technically Gears of War. It was either Gears of War or Left 4 Dead 2, and Left 4 Dead 2 is like my all-time favorite like video game period. But those were like my first introduction to horror media, and like if you're familiar with those games, it's just gore. It's just very graphic gore. So seeing that as like a 10, 12-year-old maybe wasn't appropriate. It piqued my morbid curiosity. Yeah. And then I guess following off with that, what is your connection or like your history with horror media in general? Like, I guess what I'm asking is like, why were you interested in making a horror game in the first place compared to any other style or subgenre of a video game?
That is actually a really good question. For horror media that I got introduced to while I was younger before I produced games, like I watch a lot of horror movies such as Halloween as well as Friday the 13th. Those were movies that always scared my mom, and she saw that I was like really liking all these horror games, so she's like, all right, now it's time for me to introduce you to stuff that scared me.
Yeah.
So throughout my life, I had a lot of horror media that I was introduced to. In terms of me getting into horror games, at first I actually didn't think I was going to get into horror games until I was in a program at my university where they're like, hey, here's like, a 2-year progression where you're making a game for 2 years, and that game ended up being Desecration. Nice. At first I had another idea for a game that I was going to be doing, however, that game was declined by the department because of how high scoped it was. Mm-hmm. So instead they're like, hey, there's a horror team that needs someone that, could help manage the team as well as like work with the programming. So I was introduced to the two of the game's original vision holders, Meg and Dom, and I started working with them for the game. Meg's an artist who's really good at, creating a concept art, and Dom's a really great musician who made almost all the audio Desecration. Awesome. And I joined the team to be their programmer, and at times I was a designer, marketer, as well as just a sound editor and video editor, so I wore a lot of hats throughout the development cycle of Desecration.
Nice. I mean, if you're comfortable with speaking with maybe for the other members of crew, what are their personal connections with horror video games or horror media? Like, what got them into specifically making super interested into making this game?
So a lot of their intrigue of horror games actually comes from the analog horror genre. At least that's what I remember hearing from Meg, as she was very inspired from stuff like the Mandela Effect, as well as like other analog horror series. In case anyone does not know what analog horror is, it's basically old augmented reality games or augmented reality video series where they use a lot of old technologies to tell a story, such as a VHS tape that's kind of corrupted or has like some weird like public service announcements. Like there's a lot of like interesting technologies that people are going back to create horror content, as there's just a whole intrigue about old technologies that no one really uses anymore, or many people don't know how to use anymore. Mm-hmm. And another inspiration for the horror behind Desecration that the two had while developing the game was PS1 horror games, PlayStation 1 games such as like Resident Evil as well as Silent Hill. A lot of those games were heavily influential towards our game's direction in terms of its art and sound, as well as like the 1990s aesthetic in general. Since the PS1 was coming out of the 90s, like almost all the games just bleed out 90s grunge and all that.
For sure. It's definitely, I guess for more context, I got the luxury to actually playtest the game for a very short period of time, and I actually got to see the graphics and the style and the atmosphere and everything, and I can definitely agree and confirm with you that like it oozes 90s retro nostalgic horror, where it still like creates a really creepy atmosphere even though it's using like 4 polygons to make a single monster. And it's miraculous they can do that. So now let's actually talk about the game itself. Let's talk about Desecration. If you were to sell me the game, give me a brief, spoiler-free, simple way of describing the game. Like, can you describe the gameplay style, the spoiler-free plot, like what's it like visually, to get me hooked, to get me interested?
So, Desecration is more of an exploration game of this man who is trying to save his brother. We lead as a character named Garrett Zeal, who is a troubled man riddled with guilt and regret of the past. his younger brother Gawain has been merged with this Eldritch Horror seed. Basically, it's a seed that, just combines with the body and just like causes him to desecrate. Our game's original name was actually Decomposition, and we had a lot of puns of decomposing and all that, but due to a copyright issue, we had to change to Desecration. Basically, yeah, there's a lot of old puns with decomposition that I could have used for the description, but due to the name change, like, they don't make as much sense anymore.
Yeah.
Gawain is basically decomposing throughout, him being merged with the seed, and he's demanding more and more bodies. And Gareth, being the older brother who wants to protect his younger brother, is feeding his brother these bodies in the hopes that he will get better. However, as he's like, just like taking these bodies from hospitals or just like killing people he finds just randomly out on the street or in the woods, just more and more bodies are piling into this underground Rum Runner tunnel that his brother now resides. Basically, for a little bit of background that's spoiler free, his brother was kind of like going through these Rum Runner tunnels that they used to explore as kids, since it was like in their backyard, as their grandfather was dealing with some shady stuff in the 1930s during the Prohibition era. Yeah, no, like there was something weird in these Rum Runner tunnels that Godwin got involved with, and now he's stuck in the tunnels, and now his brother's coming back down with these bodies that he puts in these coffins, and he's just delivering these coffins to his brother. Kind of a macabre game, as I say it out loud. However, that was just like the interesting narrative that was designed by my team, and it's a really fun narrative to explore with. Like, you just see all these weird, like, bodies of the people that you previously, like, fed to your brother, like, calling out, like, kind of taunting you. Yeah, like, they're, like, so poking creepy out of the walls, and they're basically just saying, hey, we hate you so much, like, we want you... Yeah, look what you've done to us, like, your comeuppance is coming soon. Just like a really fun vibe in total. Like, thinking about the game and also, like, seeing it all come together, it's kind of fun just seeing, like, how depressing the situation is. Like, just imagine you're in the shoes of Gareth. Like, you have an older or actually younger sibling, and they're just like merged with this horrific being, and they're just demanding something, other bodies, just to be, sustained.
That's so... It's so good as like a form of media as well, because it's relatable in the way is like, as an older sibling myself, you only want the best for your younger sibling. Even if you have like an estranged or rough relationship, you only want to like take care of your family, take care of your family members and look out for them. But then it adds that like super Lovecraftian, like creepy monster horror of just like, I know it's my brother, I'm looking and know like somewhere deep in his soul, somewhere in this gross decaying, decomposing thing, it's my brother, but what I'm visually looking at is not my brother at all. So it's that weird of like, it's like that hopelessness that like you're holding on to nothing but trying, that desperation.
Yeah.
We kind of covered this a lot, but I remember when I had previous conversations with you, what are just like a lot of the heavy inspirations for the game? Like, what pieces of media or ideas heavily inspired the gameplay, the narrative, the graphics? You already mentioned the analog horror trend that's going on, PS2, PS1 graphics. You and me talked about mouthwashing, and if you would like to touch on that more.
Yeah, so mouthwashing actually launched a year into our production, but upon seeing the narrative of mouthwashing, we kind of had to, get some influences of how they told their story. It's really hard to talk about mouthwashing without spoiling the game too much.
Yeah.
But if you know the intentions or, who the main character of mouthwashing is, you could probably find some similarities between him as well as Gareth. To the degrees of, like, how you are kind of seeing it through the lens of a different perspective for horror games than usual. I guess another comparison would be the story of James Sunderland in Silent Hill 2.
Yeah.
That whole storyline of James Sunderland is so insane, especially when you get things revealed about what James had done before he went to Silent Hill again to find his wife. A lot of the things that Gareth has done in the past, as you're recollecting, like, what he's done and all that, you kind of get to see a picture of a more morally gray person. Like, at first, he's heroic as he's trying to save his younger brother. However, as more things come together, you realize, Gareth might be a bit more gray than, the black and white hero that we're, kind of, wanting to, see in a horror game. And that's kind of the reason why we like the horror game media. As in a lot of action games, adventure games, or even RPG games, like, you're usually the hero.
Yeah.
But in horror games, you're allowed to, kind of go into the gray area of,
I'm playing as this person, and I have to play as this person, even though they might not be, not so good.
Yeah, even in Amnesia. Oh, sorry to interrupt.
No, go ahead.
Yeah.
You can go ahead.
Yeah, even Amnesia and The Dark Descent, like, you kind of play as a person that you're like, okay, I don't know who I am, but I'm playing as this person in this weird, like, creepy castle in the 1800s. But then you're piecing things together of, oh, this is this guy who's lost his memories, and this is like us regaining these memories, and we're this kind of person.
That's, I guess, you described it so well, especially with like your game and all the other new games you reference. It's just you're forced to play as the main character, but the plot is a slow burn drip fed to you. So you slowly just build the pieces together of just like, hey, maybe my protagonist is not the best guy, but I have to like, you can't like quit the game. You can't like switch characters. You have to keep playing as Gareth. You have to keep playing as James, which is definitely a good creative way to flip the script of other pieces of media, like from like movies or like first-person shooters, where you're always playing the hero. You don't ever get to have that chance to add like a morally questionable gray area. We have further conversations about this where it's a little bit open to interpretation, especially with some of the story elements and visual story elements that you have. So personally, to me, the way you framed that, like the story is a little bit about like the loss of a loved one and dealing with that grief, especially since with when you're interacting with your brother, you're looking at something, like I already stated, that's so unrecognizable, and the stages of grief affect everybody differently and independently. To me, interpreting that is just like he's going through stages of grief and he's looking at something that used to be his brother. It's kind of holding him back, weighing him down, this thing that used to be his brother, this monster, what his brother turned into.
And there's some semblances of his brother that is shown within the art and model of Godwin in the game. We actually do have, like, you know, appearances of Godwin, like, not within the game, but in a lot of our concepts. We actually drew what Godwin used to look like before we kind of, you know, messed him up a little bit within his quote-unquote rotted design. Mm-hmm. In a sense that we never really called Godwin a monster. We always called him rotted because there's always, like, you know, a sense that Godwin's still in there. Uh-huh. However, he's just so unrecognizable that he kind of looks monstrous to the point where he's almost unrecognizable as a human. Even though you still see the characteristics of a human within him, as well as just, you know, him still reaching out to Gareth. Even though at times he doesn't recognize his brother, there's just semblances of just like the younger brother that he grew up with still within Godwin that makes Gareth, you know, continue pushing on, being like, no, I'm going to push this annoying coffin. I'm just going to keep on trying to save him as much as I can.
Yeah. That was a wonderful response, by the way. I swear, I feel like I'm being a bad host. I swear I'm paying attention. So the next question I'm going to ask is, if you could walk me through why certain elements such as like sound design, music, and like other creative aspects were chosen. Did you guys, I guess the structure of implementing it, did you guys have a vision at first, then blocked it out, and then put it into it? I guess more example was like sound design. Yeah. Or like when you're designing a monster or designing like an atmosphere, did you have like an idea in mind and then came up with ideas of just like sounds you could come up to match the vibe, something like that?
So a lot of the first few months of development was a lot of research into what makes things scary. Mm-hmm. And a lot of like training or like any sort of education about game design, like you always want to try and, you know, make things as, you know, pleasant looking as possible or sound as pleasant as possible. With horror, you have to throw all that out the window. Yeah. A lot of times we had to look into what scares people visually and also in terms of audio. We looked into a lot of like old classic horror movies such as The Exorcist, for example, where at the beginning theme of the movie, you feel a sense of unease while listening to it. That is because they added a very low frequency of bees, you know, just normally buzzing. Mm-hmm. And that usually causes people to have high anxiety because, well, bees buzzing means something bad's about to happen to you. Mm-hmm. So we utilized a lot of old techniques like that in order to, you know, give our game more of a, you know, scary feel and just, you know, scare players. We also had, you know, look into ways to make players somewhat uncomfortable. Of course, you don't want to make them super uncomfortable to the point where they don't want to play your game. Mm-hmm. However, we had to look into techniques of how do I, you know, get someone to be on the edge of their seat or feel uncomfortable. Like, you know, not want to go down that hallway, but then realize slowly in the horrific fact that they have to go down that hallway that they don't want to go down. Yeah. Oh, you kind of jump-started. That was another question I was going to ask later on. It was just like trying to find that balance between being a good, effective horror game,
but also making sure still people want to play that game. But I'll ask that question a little bit later. Also, I didn't know that about The Exorcist, that the bee droning. I did not know that. I mean, it makes sense. It naturally induces anxiety in people. This is Editor Lily back. One of the segments actually got cut out and I didn't get to include it, but I asked Mike a question about, oh fuck, I gotta sneeze. Sorry about that. I just got hit by a fucking sneeze attack. Okay, anyways, I asked Mike what were some of the challenges with developing a game as an independent studio or independent team, and what were some highs or lows of directing the development of a game in general. That cut out from the recording, so I'm just including it now. So yeah.
When you're working with a studio or as like, just a larger team in general, there's always like certain rules that you have to follow in order to, abide by like studio guidelines or just abide by general guidelines by, what you need to do to make a game successful and what you need to do in terms of like, keeping to a company brand.
Mm-hmm.
Since we're a very small studio and also just independent, like we kind of just make our branding as we go. Like we have a lot more like fluidity and freedom to, kind of go in a direction that we want to go. Mm-hmm. Of course, throughout time, we do have to, add some more structure because if you are kind of free forever, you kind of fall into pitfalls of, oh, we don't know how to do this. How do we set this up?
Yeah.
And this kind of goes into like some of the downsides as being a small studio, which is no one really knows who you are when you start. When you make your first game, like you're kind of throwing it out into the wind. Like you could have great marketing or, just great ways of like getting your game out there. However, you still have to, go against like 500 other games that releases on Steam every day. For one of the main platforms that we're releasing our game on Steam, it gets a lot of games all the time from people all around the world.
Yeah.
Especially since we're in a very domestic market of the United States. It's very hard to stand out compared to a lot of other US releases. Mm-hmm. Another major downin of being a small studio is the lack of funding, since video games can get very expensive. From personal experience, I'm not going to go into my finances, but I spent quite a bit to, get the studio up and running as well as getting Desecration to where it is now. Mm-hmm. Of course, like you get a lot of support from people throughout your friends and family. However, a lot of it is you're kind of in it by yourself, and it is a very passionate field. If you want to make money, I don't recommend going into game design.
I mean, it's got to be your own advocate. But there are really good stories with independent games. Like some of the most popular games and recognizable horror games that people know today, like, I mean, The Binding of Isaac is not a horror game, but The Binding of Isaac is a good example. That's an indie game, independent studio, and it got super duper popular, and it's now a video game classic. There's definitely a lot of highs and lows with becoming an independent studio, but like you said, I feel like you do get a little bit more freedom because a bigger AAA studio comes more money, comes more people, higher ups trying to pull the strings and like, sway our direction in one way when in reality you really want to go it this way. So to build off that, what did you and your crew do to make your game stand out? Or what were your goals and objectives to make the game stand out and make it unique in the horror, survival horror subgenre, or as a video game in general?
This is where it's like an interesting question for me to answer, because it's kind of more of like the subtle and little things that make Desecration stand out. Our story in itself of you're feeding dead bodies to your brother who's rotting away because this eldritch creature.
Yeah.
That stands out.
Yeah.
Like a lot of things in terms of horror games, like a lot of elements that comes into making horror games memorable is the story and the environment you put in them. Desecration, you follow Garrett Steele as he's going through these like disgustingly rotted rum runner tunnels that are just covered with flesh and just like just random like gore and all that. Like, well, it's not really random, it's all like well placed, but there's just like all this gore around that makes it really stand out in the world building. To a degree, we were slightly inspired by David Skamansky's Iron Lung, and if you don't know what Iron Lung is, you're in a submarine in the middle of a blood ocean. Like simple things like that.
Eldritch, very abstract. Sorry to interject.
Oh no, it's all good. Like simple things like that is what we tried doing to make Desecration stand out. Mm-hmm. We also try to stand out by just kind of going for the direction of, we are a game that takes place in the 1990s. Like, it's late 1990. We got to make it look like it's in the 90s. Like, we have a VHS like camcorder filter over our camera, as well as like a lot of uses of VHS in the game. Like, a lot of our game story and beats are within VHS tapes as well as like cassette, tube TVs. That's where a lot of information regarding the character's past is revealed through. One of the other things that we made sure that our game included was the look of the 1990s. Like we did a lot of like shaders and lighting choices to make the game feel like it was from the early 2000s.
Yeah.
Even though we are in 2025, it's still surprising to say that we're in 2025. But we try to make a game look like it came out in 2002.
It definitely does. Like, I guess the only thing that unfortunately like draws it out is that like when you realize you're playing it on like a hypermodern laptop or a hypermodern console, but like graphically speaking, it does look like it's ripped straight out of the era it came from or its modeling. We touched on this a little bit earlier, but what are some of the struggles that you and your crew experienced pacing out the horror in the game? Specifically speaking, how did you combat juggling jump scares versus a slow burn, slower tension building horror?
Tension building horror, I have to say, is probably one of the hardest things to do. As the reason why many people say that jump scares are cheap scares, it's literally because they are cheap scares. Like it's an instant feedback of someone, randomly screaming when something like, comes in their face and screams loudly. We did not want to go for that approach in our game because we did want to give someone a cheap scare. However, in order to not give a cheap scare, you do have a lot of expenses of time as well as like various iterations, make someone scared. Like, how do we make someone uncomfortable and be at the edge of their seat of, oh, is something bad about to happen? When it's going to happen? Like, I don't know what's going on. That is like kind of like one of the difficulties of juggling around. How do we make that scary for someone?
Yeah.
A lot of it comes from just kind of like testing. Like we had to test like, okay, is this scary? Like we bring someone in front of our computer. We usually try to, get someone that's never seen the game before. Like they have no clue what it is outside of this is a horror game. And we try to get them to play the game, and we see their reactions of like maybe they're verbally talking, like talking about how scared they are, or we look into the subtle things like how's their hand, doing on the mouse, or how are they position themselves on the chair? Like, are they leaning in closer, or are they like being more relaxed? If they're more relaxed, that could be a sign of them getting bored. But if we see them more tense, that's when we know we are getting them to be a little bit scared, even if they won't admit it to us.
Yeah, because the body language definitely speaks volumes. For me, at least, my body language when I'm playing a horror game or watching a horror movie is that I definitely like am stiffened and tensed out, and I just don't talk. But also, same time, like you gotta watch people's body language and listen to what they're saying and how they're reacting because everybody reacts to horror differently.
Oh yeah.
And then I have to ask, like, I feel like I have to ask this question. I feel like obligated to, but any advice you would want to give to inspiring game developers going into specifically the horror or survival horror medium?
One of my best advices for anyone wanting to get into horror or survival horror in general is, even if it's not scary to you, you should still try another view because throughout my time working on Desecration, because I'm like one of the people who developed it and I was like one of the leads of the team, at times I'm like, I'm not scared by this, like no one's ever going to think this is scary. But then I just like pull someone that's hardly seen my game, like for example my roommate, and I just see him be a little bit more tense. Of course he has some bravado in him and he's not going to show that he's scared of my game or anything, but seeing people who try to act like they're not scared be scared kind of gets me to think, oh, we are onto something here. Even though I may not think about it, it's always another viewpoint that will help you be like, I'm getting something right here. And of course, like there's sometimes where you will have like, failures, or you have times of, oh, can I really make this? One of my best advices is always reach out to someone who has done this before. As in game development, even though we are still a very young field of people who are making interactable experiences for players, there's always someone who has done something similar or has done something that you have done before that you could reach out to, say, hey, I'm really struggling. How did you get through this? This is something that I've been doing for a lot of people who are just starting out with game development. Even though I've not really done it for long, I am still able to, have experiences that I had to share my story down to the people who are, just starting, or sometimes people who have been doing it for a while, but they're trying out a new thing. So game developers, even though we are kind of stereotyped to be like introverts who never really want to talk with anyone, we're always in the basement, just like headphones on, like don't talk to me. They're actually some of the kindest, like sometimes extroverted, like we're some of the kindest like people out there that always want to bring a reaching hand to someone who does need help while developing games. Because at the end of the day, we are all creators just trying something out, and also we're trying to express like, just a story that we want to tell, and in a form of we want to tell a story that you have a choice of what happens in the end.
Mm-hmm.
Unlike books, movies, and television shows, it always has a predestined ending. Meanwhile, with games, it's open for anyone to pick up and create their own story and create their own ending and create their own conclusions in a sense of like what they were able to see in the gameplay or what they were able to explore. If you ever need help while developing a game, always reach out to others, always have more people playtest it, and there's always someone who might have done something similar or has done something before that could give you like advice or just reach out and be like, oh, this is how I did it. Like sometimes it's even the most simple things that you overlook.
Yeah, that's such a good, insightful answer.
Yeah, no, thank you for having me on the show. If you'd like to check out Desecration, we just launched our new trailer. It's on YouTube and Instagram, on our accounts, Cozy Crow Studios. If you'd like to wishlist our game, we currently have an option on Steam to wishlist our game, as well as an itch.io page where you can follow up our development and updates. I would like to spend this quick ending segment to thank every single member of my team. It's going to be a little bit of a list, so without further adu, I would like to give a thank you to Bowen, Erica, Jake, Jane, Penelope, Max, Derek, Aiden, Trevon, Devin, Dom, my roommate Edison, who has helped with some of the playtesting, Jalen, Kylie, Megan, who was the original vision holder of the game, Nelson, Hyung, Brandon, Steven, and Trey. And I also like to give a shout out to my studio's Crow owner, Joshua, who will be releasing the trailer of his upcoming game, Crow Heist, which will be the next game of our studio after Desecration.
Yeah, if you're interested in all that and you feel so inclined, please go follow them on Instagram, on YouTube, on wherever social media is, wherever you take it. Also, it is incredibly helpful, and if you enjoyed tonight's broadcast, wishlist the game on Steam. It really means a lot to the team and the crew, and it shows that you're interested. Thank you for coming on tonight. I had a wonderful conversation. It was very insightful. If you dig this and you want to hear more from me or hear more content like this, you can go to WIUX's website. You can either listen on the B-Side radio, 8 to 9 p.m. every Friday night, or if you go to the podcast tab on YouTube or Newgrounds or WIUX podcast tab, I have prior podcast episodes of Surviving This Horror. I just do the same shit where I just talk about horror games and horror media and why I like it. To stay up to date on new episodes and other info, or if you have any suggestions, I will point you in the direction to follow me on Instagram, on Twitter, on Newgrounds, or on what used to be called Twitter, at Survive This WIUX. And once again, thank you WIUX for the assistance, and thank you everybody for listening and tuning in. And thank you, Mike, for joining me. I had a wonderful chat. Go follow Cozy Crow everywhere and wishlist Desecration.